The social context of the United States. The United States stands as a striking example of diversity and contradiction. With a population exceeding 330 million, the country is home to people from nearly every corner of the world. The dominant group, white Americans of European descent, comprises about 60% of the population. Other significant communities include African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Latino Americans, and Native Americans, each carrying their own histories of triumph, struggle, and cultural contribution. This incredible demographic tapestry is both an opportunity for cultural enrichment and a point of tension, often shaping national debates and public policy. America's story is deeply intertwined with issues of race, ethnicity, and social mobility. Its history carries scars from slavery, segregation, waves of immigration, and civil rights movements that have challenged and continue to challenge the ideal of equal opportunity for all. Today, the conversation around race in America remains contentious, touching every sphere of society, from jobs and education to access to healthcare, housing, and the criminal justice system. Policies such as affirmative action, originally designed to address historical disparities and boost representation for minorities, have sparked passionate arguments across the political spectrum. Proponents argue that such measures are necessary correctives, while opponents, often from the majority group, see them as forms of reverse discrimination. These debates echo loudly in university admissions, hiring practices, and even within the court system, revealing a nation still wrestling with its identity and promises. In urban centers, immigrant neighborhoods thrive, maintaining languages and traditions from homelands, yet sometimes facing suspicion or prejudice. Rural areas struggle with entirely different issues about race, class, and belonging. The so-called melting pot is, in reality, more like a mosaic, where assimilation and cultural pride coexist in a dynamic, complicated tension. The growing Asian American population in particular faces the model minority stereotype, both praised and constrained by expectations of educational and economic excellence, yet also facing a rise in hate crimes and suspicion, particularly following global events such as the COVID-19 pandemic. The media and the political sphere play significant roles in shaping and sometimes distorting perceptions about race and justice. News coverage of crimes involving individuals from different ethnic backgrounds is frequently sensationalized or politicized, fueling online debate and sometimes inciting division. Social media, in its turn, amplifies both support and hostility, allowing grassroots movements to flourish, but also magnifying misinformation and prejudice. Law enforcement and the judiciary have long been lightning rods in the conversation about racial justice. Well-documented disparities exist. African Americans and Latinos are statistically more likely to be stopped, searched, charged, and sentenced more harshly than white counterparts. Asian Americans, while sometimes seen as less visible in these discourses, increasingly find themselves both allies and targets, depending on prevailing narratives and local tensions. America's promise, and its challenge, remains creating a society where diversity strengthens the community rather than weakens it. Each generation confronts old prejudices in new forms, adapting the ideals of liberty and equality to a world that shifts constantly through immigration, demographic change, and law. In this landscape, individual stories like those of Emma Tran and other Americans who find themselves at the heart of tragedy, both reflect and influence the complex web of identity, belonging, and justice that defines the United States. Main character, Emma Tran. Emma Tran sits at the delicate crossroads of American identity, heritage, and generational expectation. Born in the bustling neighborhoods of New York City to Vietnamese immigrant parents, Emma has spent her entire 22 years negotiating the duality of being both fully American and, in some eyes, perpetually foreign. The nuances of her life reflect the realities of millions who identify as Asian American. Never just one thing, never just one story. Physically, Emma blends seamlessly into the urban tapestry of her city. She bears the features of her family's homeland: dark hair, careful eyes, a stature that speaks to the comfort, and occasional burden, of moving between worlds. English is her first language, but at home her parents urge her to speak Vietnamese, to remember the stories, the food, the manners that shaped generations before her. She laughs at jokes with American friends, but some cultural references fly past her. At home, she prepares traditional dishes with her mother, though the recipes are often a blend of memory and New World convenience. Her life is that duality, at once thoroughly American and authentically Vietnamese. Emma's parents, like so many refugees from the post-war era, arrived with little except the hope that their children would one day have a better life. That hope manifests every day in Emma's determination. She is by all accounts diligent. She juggles a rigorous academic schedule at a local state university, where she is a senior, majoring in biology with dreams of applying to medical school, with long shifts at a neighborhood boutique. The fateful night. February 18, 2017, began as a night of celebration for Emma Tran, a precious chance to embrace her heritage while displaying the comfort and confidence of a young American woman. That evening she attended the annual Lunar New Year festival in Manhattan's Chinatown, surrounded by red lanterns, the snapping of firecrackers, and the laughter of hundreds united in renewal and hope. The warmth of the evening seemed to dissolve the exhaustion of working 2 jobs and the stress mounting from impending midterms. With her friends departing at midnight, Emma offered to drive herself home, eager for a few moments of solitary reflection on the neon-lit highways that connected city and suburb. It was close to 2:40 a.m., as Emma merged onto the sloping expressway that wound through the outer boroughs of Queens, a stretch of road known for its poor lighting and harsh curves, often deserted this time of night. The radio played quietly as she replayed scenes from the night. Her mother's delighted smile during the dragon dance, the taste of sticky rice and sweet coconut milk, the sensation of being fully, peacefully herself. Instinctively cautious when driving at night, Emma kept her speed well below the posted limit. The darkness was nearly complete, street lamps flickered intermittently, and the looming branches of roadside trees cast long shadows across the asphalt. She remembered her father's warning. Always watch for the unexpected, especially in America. Danger comes quick and sometimes from nowhere. As her car ascended a gentle incline, Emma's thoughts were abruptly shattered by motion, a chaotic blur erupting from the shadows. A group of teenagers, nearly invisible in their dark clothing, suddenly darted across the highway on customized, headlightless bicycles. There was a split second, hardly enough to react. Emma's heart slammed as she drew a sharp breath, slamming her foot down on the brake. Tires screeched, her body surged with adrenaline, but the laws of physics and fate collided. The impact was jarring, the airbag exploded with a deafening pop, and her car spun abruptly, side-swiping the metal barrier before coming to a shocked, shuddering stop. Dazed, Emma opened her eyes to the smell of burnt chemicals and the desperate shouts echoing from farther down the road. The scene outside was one of instant chaos. Flashing streetlights revealed several bodies sprawled across the tarmac, their bikes tangled in a surreal sculpture of twisted metal. In moments, more figures materialized out of the darkness, some running to help, others shouting in confusion or anger. Emma's body trembled. Instinct had her checking for her phone, but her fingers refused to obey. Within minutes, the piercing wail of sirens cut through the night. EMTs rushed to administer aid while a pair of police officers, faces set in grim concern, ushered Emma away from the growing crowd. The hostile energy around her was palpable. Bystanders shouted, some filming on their phones, others blaming her before they could grasp the reality. One angry voice accused her of not paying attention. Another speculated about texting or drinking. Emma, struggling to stand and reeling from shock, tried to explain herself, but her words barely broke through the cacophony. The officers, recognizing her mounting distress and the volatility of the crowd, led her to their patrol car for safety. The night, meant for celebration, had violently transformed. Emma's world, and the fate of several young strangers, had been forever altered in a single terrible instant. Chaotic scene at the crash site. The moments that followed the crash unfolded with a raw, unfiltered chaos that seemed to blur the boundary between nightmare and reality. As the echo of screeching tires faded, and the lifeless hum of engine idling took over, the darkness was pierced by a cacophony of shouts, slamming car doors, and the sharp wail of sirens approaching from the distance. Emma, still dazed and trembling from the force of the airbag and the terror of the collision, stepped out of her crumpled vehicle, her senses assaulted by the harsh smells of burnt rubber and leaking gasoline. All around her, confusion and panic escalated with breathtaking speed. On the cold, uneven asphalt, several teenagers lay sprawled, some twisted in unnatural positions, others clutching their limbs and crying out in pain, their faces pale and contorted. Their customized bikes, now just piles of twisted metal and plastic, littered the road, some wheels still spinning aimlessly in the aftermath. The eerie flicker of a few operational street lamps cast uneven shadows, accentuating the sense of surrealism and horror. Within mere minutes, people began to materialize from the darkness, Nearby residents, late-night drivers who stopped, even a few insomniacs lured by the commotion. The crowd thickened rapidly, and a palpable anger started to simmer amid the collective panic. Frantic voices competed in the night, some shouted for help, some barked out orders, and others turned accusatory almost immediately, pointing at Emma, labeling her as the culprit. Someone banged a fist on the hood of her car. Another person kicked open a door to gain access to a trapped teen. A couple of people began filming with their phones, narrating their outrage for social media as emergency responders fought to push through the gathering storm of bystanders. Paramedics and firefighters arrived next, setting up a triage zone right on the shattered pavement and working furiously beneath the flashing red and blue lights. Police officers, faced with a surging crowd and a tense, emotionally charged atmosphere, struggled to assert control. A few officers quickly identified Emma as the driver, moving to extract her from the encroaching mob, both to record her account and to protect her safety. Shouts of, "It's her fault!" and "Did you see how fast she was going?" clashed with panicked pleas for assistance. Someone attempted to overturn Emma's car, claiming a victim might be pinned underneath, while two teenagers in the crowd began arguing with officers about what really happened. For Emma, the world became a blur. Flashes of devastated faces, the metallic taste of fear and guilt, the pressure of a crowd that seemed poised to tip into violence at any moment. A paramedic pressed her to sit down, quickly checking for signs of concussion or shock, while a young policewoman tried to shield her from the barrage of cameras and pointed fingers. A wailing parent, barely restrained by another officer, demanded to know who was going to pay for their child's pain. Meanwhile, police urgently tried to keep the crowd back, fearing the chaos could spark a greater tragedy. In this crucible of blame, adrenaline, and heartbreak, the crash scene became more than just an accident site. It was a crucible for the vortex of emotions, racial tensions, and public distrust that had been quietly seething beneath the city's surface. The chaos of the night would burn itself into the memory of everyone present, but for Emma, it would haunt her as the beginning of an ordeal she never could have imagined. Investigation and public opinion. With the sprawling, blinking aftermath of the crash, the wheels of American law enforcement and public scrutiny began to turn in force. In the immediate hours following the accident, Emma Tran found herself swept into a labyrinthine process that is equal parts clinical and deeply human, marked by the impersonal steps of forensic analysis and the sharp, emotionally charged glare of public judgment. The first phase of the investigation was technical and methodical. Traffic reconstruction specialists descended on the scene before the morning sun had crested the rooftops, measuring skid marks, collecting debris, taking meticulous photographs of battered bike frames, shattered glass, and the trajectory of Emma's car against the marriage of shadows and streetlight. Blood alcohol content was tested. Emma's was conclusively negative. Phone records were pulled, demonstrating she was not distracted by calls or messaging. The black box in her car, designed to record data like speed and sudden braking, was retrieved and analyzed. Preliminary findings emerged. Emma had been driving below the speed limit, her reflexes had triggered emergency braking, and there was no evidence of mechanical failure or intoxication. Yet, as has become all too common in American society, the technical details and sober facts were quickly eclipsed by the tidal wave of public opinion and media sensationalism. News outlets seized upon the tragedy, framing the story through their own ideological and commercial lenses. Headlines ranged from sympathetic, young woman's life shattered after fateful crash, to inflammatory, deadly reckless driving by Asian American student. Within hours, Emma's face began circulating on social media, accompanied by speculation, assumptions, and thinly veiled accusations. Online discourse in the United States thrives on division and speed. Armchair detectives and social commentators flooded platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok, drawing bold conclusions and debating Emma's responsibility. Some, employing the rhetoric of social justice, demanded justice for the teens, arguing that any driver must be held accountable for causing harm, irrespective of the context. Others, notably advocates within the Asian American community, rallied around Emma, decrying what they saw as a rush to judgment tainted by long-standing racial prejudices and anti-immigrant sentiment. The narrative rapidly became as much about race, identity, and the American legal system as about the harrowing facts themselves. For many Asian Americans, Emma became a symbol, willing or not, of a demographic often stereotyped as model minorities, yet readily vilified when tragedy strikes. Old wounds were reopened, Debates about racial bias in policing and prosecution resurfaced, echoing with cases from decades past where minority defendants faced harsher outcomes due to their ethnicity. Investigators themselves were not immune to pressure. The media circus and mounting public interest forced the police department and district attorney to tread carefully, knowing every misstep would be dissected in real time. The police commissioner at a press conference emphasized fairness and transparency, while also appealing for patience, a plea that largely fell on deaf ears among those wanting instant answers and retribution. The legal complexities of the case only added fuel to the fire. The absence of clear video evidence, no surveillance footage or dashcam recording, just a handful of panicked witness testimonies, meant that every interpretation was open to debate. The testimony of the surviving cyclists varied, muddied by trauma, adrenaline, and conflicting loyalties. Some insisted Emma must have been speeding or inattentive. Others privately admitted that their improvised night ride, without lights or reflective gear, was fraught with risk from the start. Beyond the technical investigation, a parallel inquisition unfolded on the internet. Conspiracy theories blossomed. Was Emma being scapegoated? Were the authorities covering up the risks posed by unsanctioned night bicycle groups in the city? Was this case yet another example of the justice system failing to protect minorities? Prominent activists and commentators, some informed, others opportunistic, stoked these questions with viral posts and impassioned live streams. Meanwhile, Emma herself was advised by her attorney to stay out of the public eye, avoid interviews, and refrain from posting on social media. But silence bred further suspicion. Critics wondered why she wasn't speaking out if she had nothing to hide, ignoring the fundamental legal advice afforded anyone in her position. A GoFundMe campaign, started by members of her university's Asian American Alliance to cover legal costs, became a flashpoint. Donations poured in alongside hateful comments accusing supporters of protecting a criminal. Even seasoned legal professionals found themselves walking a tightrope. The defense team prepared evidence and quietly assembled expert witnesses, accident reconstructionists, psychologists, and character references from Emma's professors and colleagues. The prosecution, pressed by grieving families and a public demanding accountability, struggled to craft a case without clear-cut evidence. They scoured Emma's background for any sign of recklessness or past infractions, of which there were none. The only record was that of a diligent, cautious young woman with an unblemished driving history. In local community centers and digital forums, the conversation grew more polarized. The families of the teenagers, devastated by loss, staged public vigils and called for justice, not excuses. Their sorrow was real and their demands entirely understandable, yet public empathy fractured as blame and suspicion ricocheted from one group to another. Some local politicians, eager to capitalize on the visibility, issued statements alternately supporting the families or warning against turning the tragedy into a racial wedge. In this maelstrom, the facts of the investigation continued to trickle out. Forensic reports affirmed the reality: no alcohol, no drugs, no phone distractions, responsible speed, but an unexpected, perilous mass of bicyclists charging across an unlit highway in the dead of night. Yet, for a significant swath of the public, logic and evidence rarely mattered as much as narrative. The accident was becoming less a question of fault and more a canvas for the anxieties, resentments, and unresolved trauma of a divided nation. Youth group and the problem of customized bicycles. The city's underbelly has always been a world unto itself, teeming with subcultures, secrets, and the unspoken rules of youth rebellion. The group of teenagers involved in the crash belonged to a burgeoning phenomenon taking root in urban America. Illegal, nighttime bicycle crews dedicated to thrill-seeking, but also to a sense of identity, belonging, and escape. This subculture, often hidden from plain view, had been sparking intense debates amongst civic leaders, law enforcement, and anxious residents well before Emma Tran's fateful drive intersected with their world. These weren't ordinary cyclists. The members of Midnight Mob, as the group called itself, were mostly local high schoolers, a diverse mix of boys and girls from working-class families and immigrant backgrounds, lured together by social media and the thrill of danger. What set their bikes apart wasn't just the lack of headlights or reflectors necessary for safety. These were custom jobs, modified in garages and cramped apartments, stripped-down frames, brake systems removed in pursuit of speed, matte black paint over every reflective surface. Some even attached small gas-powered motors blending the line between bicycle and motorcycle. Each new modification was a badge of honor, a rite of passage, and a physical testament to their defiance of city rules. Organized rides started as word-of-mouth challenges, first through whispered rumors in cafeteria lines, then through encrypted group chats or countdown posts on Instagram. Rules were simple. Meet at a predetermined location, dress in dark, unidentifiable clothing, and trust only those you saw face to face. Events typically took place in desolate industrial zones, empty parking lots, and, as their confidence grew, the open stretches of highways in the dead of night. For the most ambitious among them, the ultimate goal was to complete a circuit through the city without being stopped by police or clocked on anyone's cameras. Bragging rights depended on both skill and luck. Near misses with traffic became trophies immortalized in shaky GoPro videos shared online after the sun rose. For many of these teens, the rides were much more than reckless escapades. Life at home was stifling. Parents worked late shifts, financial anxieties brewed beneath the surface, and schools were often overwhelmed, unable to offer meaningful outlets for creativity, ambition, or even frustration. The city itself, glittering in the distance, seemed full of promise yet stubbornly out of reach. Midnight bicycle gangs offered community, adrenaline, and a language of rebellion that transcended backgrounds. Membership meant not caring about tomorrow's consequences, living fully in a moment of shared, outlaw camaraderie. For the ringleader, known as Ace, it was a way to command respect that had eluded him in the classroom or on the basketball court. For his friends, some of whom were newcomers to the city, others who'd lived in the same apartment block all their lives, it was an antidote to invisibility, an assertion of agency in a city that barely looked up when they passed by in daylight. Parents and community leaders saw things differently. They remembered quieter nights, when the only danger was the distant threat of gang activity or the rare mugger lurking in a subway station. Now those worries had given way to new fears, news stories of fatal collisions, paralyzing injuries, and the gut-wrenching uncertainty of not knowing if their child would come home. Some parents had tried to intervene, confiscating bike parts or grounding repeat offenders, but the pull of the night rides and the friendships found there often outmatched any efforts at discipline. In the week following Emma's crash, community meetings erupted into chaos. Some blamed the parents, others blamed City Hall for failing to regulate what they called an epidemic. Still others quietly admitted to feeling helpless, caught between the enticement of freedom and the stark necessity of keeping children safe. Law enforcement, meanwhile, found themselves overwhelmed and sometimes outmatched. Chasing bicycle crews through narrow city streets or onto busy freeways presented enormous risks, not only to the riders but also to officers, bystanders, and innocent drivers. Several tragic incidents elsewhere in the city had led to public outcry and, paradoxically, to a decision among some precincts to reduce hot pursuits, reasoning that letting the teens ride out the moment was ultimately safer than trying to intercept them at speed. This hands-off approach, however, proved controversial. Critics accused the police of turning a blind eye, while frustrated officers pointed to limited resources and the futility of arresting minors who would be released within hours. The city spent months debating a new set of ordinances, including mandatory bike registration and curfews, but implementation lagged behind the pace of the underground rides. The media, for its part, was torn between fascination and condemnation. Long-form features painted sympathetic portraits of lost youth, drawing parallels with the car culture of decades past when baby boomers raced muscle cars on moonlit roads. Sensationalist outlets, however, published police mugshots of young, mostly minority riders and splash stories across front pages about shadow gangs terrorizing motorists, stoking anxiety among suburbs already resistant to change. Local television crews staked out bike shops and public parks, interviewing anyone willing to talk about the latest chase. The teens themselves responded with a mixture of pride and annoyance. Every headline was both a warning and an invitation to test the city's boundaries further. In the aftermath of the accident involving Emma, policy conversations reached a tipping point. Some politicians called for zero-tolerance crackdowns, proposing steep fines for parents and even criminal liability for shop owners who sold bike parts without identification. Others insisted on a broader, more compassionate response: youth engagement programs, mentorship, and creating legal nighttime spaces for sports and cycling. The core question became one of balance: how to preserve safety without criminalizing poverty or youth culture. The members of Midnight Mob did not see themselves as criminals. In private interviews conducted after the crash, many spoke about a desire for adventure, recognition, and a sense of family they felt was missing elsewhere. Descriptions of near misses and adrenaline highs were punctuated by quieter admissions of fear, both of being caught and sometimes of what the night would take from them next. Some expressed regret about pushing boundaries, others doubled down, angry at being scapegoated by adults who, they said, just didn't get it. Ultimately, the issue of illegal modded bike crews is a mirror for larger anxieties in American cities: generational divides, racial frictions, shifting notions of responsibility and blame. For those on the outside, it's easy to see only the wreckage and risk. For the teens themselves, each ride was a statement, a pedal-powered declaration that they existed, they mattered, and until the city gave them something better, they would continue to ride under cover of darkness, chasing the freedom only dangerous roads could offer. Indictment and legal battle. When dawn broke after the tragic crash, the machinery of American law began to move with cold, relentless precision. It started quietly. An arrest warrant issued, Emma Tran's world shrinking from the wide uncertainty of the city to the sterile confines of police stations, interview rooms, and eventually courtrooms awash in fluorescent light. She was charged formally with reckless driving causing death, a phrase that, while clinical, carried the weight of ruin. The possible sentence ranged from a few years to more than a decade in state prison, and every word spoken in that initial hearing felt like a stone laid on her chest. Her family was in disbelief. The American dream that had seemed fragile but possible for so many years was now buckling under the pressure of legal fees, public scorn, and the looming threat of separation. Calling lawyers was the first step, then, soon after, calling community organizations that served the local Vietnamese and broader Asian American populations. The gravity of the case galvanized both support and outrage. Within days, Emma's name lit up community forums and leaders mobilized to rally support. They set up fundraisers, reached out to legal aid organizations, circulated petitions both online and offline, and wrote op-eds demanding a fair trial for a daughter of the community. But there was also a dark shadow. Public backlash erupted almost as quickly as support did. On certain forums and social media channels, Emma became a symbol alternately of reckless youth and unjust scapegoating. Some voices outside the Asian community cast blame, painting her as privileged or careless. Others, sometimes from rival ethnic enclaves or anonymous online users, turned the incident into a proxy for broader cultural grievances. Hate mail and thinly veiled threats found their way into the Tran family mailbox, and local news stations sent camera crews to their apartment, hoping for a tearful soundbite or a scene of confrontation. Every action Emma took, every statement released by her increasingly frazzled legal team, seemed to stoke the fire rather than dampen it. Emma's initial legal defense was cobbled together by a rotating cast of overworked public defenders, each juggling heavy caseloads and pushed to the brink by the demands of a system rarely sympathetic to those without means. Her family scrambled to raise money for a private attorney, a person who knew the local DA's office, who might have a prayer of navigating the subtleties of jury selection, plea negotiations, and the fraught maze of public opinion. Even with community donations, every dollar spent on legal fees meant one less for rent, groceries, or Emma's siblings' tuition. America's promise of justice, they learned, came at a steep and often unaffordable price. The prosecutor, a hard-charging official with political ambitions, sought to make an example of the case. The tragic deaths and the rising public anger created a climate where, even before any facts had been presented, the expectation of a conviction hovered above the proceedings. Emma Tran was depicted alternately as a reckless outsider unsuited to American roads and as a dangerous precedent, a driver who should have known better given the risks of nighttime travel and urban traffic. Media coverage was relentless. Tabloids splashed Emma's face across their covers, often highlighting her ethnicity with coded or explicit language, while round-the-clock cable news panels debated her guilt or innocence with only the thinnest familiarity with the facts. Editorials in major newspapers took sides, some framing her as a tragic pawn and others as an object lesson in the need for stricter traffic enforcement. This pre-trial publicity saturated the potential jury pool, and Emma's legal team filed repeated, desperate motions for a change of venue, fearing that local jurors, whipped up by months of outrage, would be unable to fairly weigh the evidence. Inside the courtroom, the legal battle became a slow-motion ordeal. The early hearings were dominated by procedural wrangling, arguments over which witnesses would be allowed, whether certain expert testimony should be excluded, and endless debate regarding the admissibility of the scant video evidence available. Emma's defense team, itself a reflection of the under-resourced plight of many minority defendants, argued forcefully that crucial surveillance footage was either missing, tampered with by the chaos at the scene, or lost to malfunction. The prosecution countered with circumstantial evidence, relying on the testimony of shaken teenagers and conflicting eyewitness accounts that reinforced their narrative. The months dragged on, and so did Emma's life. She was released on bail with the help of a local church group, but the restrictions were stifling. Electronic monitoring, curfews, regular check-ins with pre-trial services. The process took a toll on her health and well-being. Her college dreams were placed on indefinite hold, her family's social circle shrank under the scrutiny, and even longtime neighbors began to pull away, wary of the spotlight that dogged the Tran family's every move. In the background, legal costs mounted. Each new round of discovery brought yet another bill, and the initial wave of donations began to dwindle as months turned into years. Emma spent countless hours reviewing depositions with her attorneys, reliving the horror of the night again and again in preparation for testimony. Her father developed high blood pressure, her mother stopped attending community gatherings, and her younger siblings faced whispers and rumors at school. The invisible price of the trial spread through every aspect of their lives, intangible but brutal. As trial dates were scheduled, postponed, and then rescheduled in a cycle that only deepened the family's sense of unreality, advocacy groups on both sides dug in their heels. Some national Asian American organizations publicized Emma's plight as emblematic of broader systemic injustice, pointing to long-standing issues of racial disparity in traffic stops and criminal sentencing. They held rallies outside the courthouse, provided media training, and wrote legal briefs in support of Emma's constitutional rights. Meanwhile, family members of the teens killed or injured in the crash organized counter-protests, demanding accountability and vowing to pursue civil suits regardless of the criminal outcome. The atmosphere around the courtroom became a tense battleground. Security was heightened, and police sometimes erected barricades to keep dueling supporters apart. Local politicians weighed in, some calling for reform of juvenile bicycle regulations, others insisting on harsh penalties as a warning. The story became a lightning rod for larger debates about policing, race, and youth culture in America. Every day Emma entered the courthouse felt like stepping into a war zone of expectations, signs held aloft either denouncing her or proclaiming her innocence. Her attorneys feared that the case, regardless of verdict, would stain her for years to come. The legal proceedings dragged on for 3 years, an eternity for a family caught in limbo. There were moments when it seemed a plea deal might be possible. Reduced charges in exchange for years of probation, mandated community service, and public apologies. The prosecution, facing intense political pressure and the raw emotions of grieving parents, balked. Ultimately, Emma's team refused to admit guilt for a tragedy they believed she had done everything possible to avoid, especially given the lack of evidence proving reckless intent. During the trial, expert witnesses were called to reconstruct the accident, analyze the physics of the crash, and assess the reliability of eyewitness memory under stress. The complexity of the case, with its intersection of urban policy failure, youth subculture, and the immigrant experience, became clear to everyone following the proceedings. The jury, forced to confront not only the facts, but also the unspoken tensions of the city itself, deliberated for days. In the end, after intense public debate and multiple admonitions from the judge, reminding all of the presumption of innocence, the jury declared there was not enough evidence to convict. Emma was acquitted and released in court, her story both a personal ordeal and a symbol of a justice system at the intersection of truth, identity, and collective reckoning. Controversial evidence. If the night of the crash was shrouded in chaos, the aftermath only brought greater ambiguity. At the center of Emma Tran's legal storm were questions that no one, not even the most seasoned investigators or legal experts, could easily answer. The case became less about clear-cut facts and more about gaps, frustrating, immutable voids in evidence, the kind that left plenty of room for interpretation, doubt, and manipulation in the court of public opinion. Emma's defense team quickly zeroed in on the absence of decisive video proof. Unlike many high-profile urban collisions, there was no dashcam footage from her Toyota, and the usual network of city-owned security cameras along that stretch of expressway happened to be non-functional that month. One camera, positioned on a lamppost just ahead of the crash, was being repaired by city workers, its memory drive removed long before the tragedy. Meanwhile, footage collected from nearby gas stations and convenience stores either failed to show the crucial moment, or arrived in police hands so late that the chain of custody was compromised. Defense attorneys argued that critical frames might have been lost or even tampered with, while prosecutors insisted the gaps were simply unfortunate coincidence, not evidence of foul play. Eyewitness testimony further muddied the waters. Many statements collected at the scene contradicted each other. Several bystanders described Emma's car as speeding, a claim flatly refuted by the car's event data recorder, which indicated she was traveling below the posted limit. Others insisted she had been distracted by her phone. Subsequent forensic analysis of her device and call logs revealed it had been untouched for hours before the accident. The teenagers who survived the crash, badly shaken and some still in shock, were split in their recollections. One stated he believed the group had the green light, while another admitted they were cutting across the highway as a dare, no lights, no warning. These inconsistencies gave both sides ammunition, but no single narrative held steady under scrutiny. Physical evidence, too, left more questions than answers. Investigators painstakingly reconstructed the scene using tire marks, damage to the guardrail, and the final resting positions of the bicycles. Still, without unbroken video documentation, experts could only theorize about the precise sequence of events. Did Emma have any real chance to stop? Could sharper senses or a more aggressive swerve have changed the outcome? The event data suggested she braked at the first sign of movement, yet forensic experts for the prosecution argued that a more alert driver might have sensed the danger a split second earlier. Debate raged over the condition of the teenagers' bikes. Every one of the Midnight Mob's rides was heavily customized. Most lacked reflectors, functional brakes, or even basic lights required by law. Police seized the bikes as evidence, documenting the intentional modifications. Handlebars sawed off for tight turns, frames painted flat black for concealment, some even with the brakes removed to maximize speed. The defense depicted these facts as proof that the teens were endangering themselves in traffic, hinting, though never stating outright, that any driver, regardless of ethnicity, would have faced the same tragic outcome. The prosecution countered that while the bikes were illegal, Emma's responsibilities as a motorist remained paramount. Jurors were asked, should a driver always expect the unexpected, even when others willfully skirt the rules? The handling of the crash scene further complicated the evidence. Within minutes of the accident, with sirens still approaching, bystanders and friends of the injured rushed into the road. Some attempted to move the teens, potentially altering the trajectory of bikes and bodies before police could photograph or measure them. A few well-meaning strangers scrambled to clear the highway for incoming ambulances, shifting piles of shattered metal off to the side in an effort to help. For the defense, this meant that any post-crash diagram of the site was irreparably flawed, the initial spatial relationships erased by chaos and good intentions. For the prosecution, this simply reinforced the narrative of confusion caused by Emma's actions. Forensic analysis of phone data provided one of the few certainties in the case. Emma's device, submissions to cell towers and GPS logs confirmed that she was not texting, calling, or searching her map near the time of the crash. But this evidence, meant to absolve her of recklessness, was often drowned out in public debate by more visceral testimony. Social media seized on the initial, mistaken eyewitness beliefs, "I saw her on her phone," and repeated them as fact, illustrating the frustrating gap between hard evidence and popular narrative. Perhaps most contentious of all, however, was the lack of reliable time-stamped footage or black-and-white proof. The accident happened in the only 10-minute span that night when the nearest traffic camera was offline, a flicker of misfortune that defense lawyers framed as almost cosmic in its cruelty. News outlets and citizen sleuths on internet forums began concocting theories. Was this a cover-up, systemic incompetence, or just tragic bad luck? Conspiracy posts circulated, fueled by screenshots and anecdotes, blurring the already fragile boundary between fact and fiction. This state of evidentiary uncertainty left the legal teams floundering for leverage in pre-trial hearings. The prosecution leaned heavily on statistical models and expert witnesses armed with laser pointers and simulation videos, digital recreations showing how a car might react at various speeds or visibility levels. These carefully crafted displays played well on screens in the courtroom, but inevitably involved degrees of conjecture. The defense employed its own accident reconstruction specialist to contest each assertion, creating a battle of dueling experts whose credibility became as much a matter of perception as of mathematics. For jurors, most of whom were neither scientists nor traffic engineers, the parade of technical exhibits was overwhelming. Cross-examinations devolved into squabbles over 75-millisecond delays and the reflectivity index of urban asphalt. Some experts swore that Emma's reaction time was within normal parameters, while others insisted she could and should have foreseen trouble given the hour and road conditions. It was less a question of guilt and more an endless volley of what-ifs. Adding fuel to the fire, the bikes themselves became physical symbols of the broader case. In close-up photographs and on tables in the evidence room, their rough welds and stripped components appeared both menacing and pitiable, echoes of lost youth and risky rebellion. Community activists argued that by putting the blame on the teens, the city was ignoring systemic failures, inadequate infrastructure, lack of youth programs, and unclear bicycle regulation enforcement. Others, however, insisted responsibility must fall somewhere, on the teens for breaking the law, or on Emma, the driver who, fairly or not, should have protected them. All these layers contributed to a legal and social fog in which real truth remained elusive. The trial was as much about holes and missing pieces as about certainties. And in the absence of a definitive narrative, bias and anxiety filled the space. Both sides knew that come verdict time, some portion of the public would remain unconvinced, their own beliefs reaffirmed by the very uncertainties of the evidence presented. Emma's fate and the collision's meaning would hang, perhaps forever, in the shadow of what could never be fully proven or known. Racial division and incitement. As the dust barely began to settle in the aftermath of the tragic accident, the underlying currents of race and identity in America surged with new intensity. What had started as a devastating traffic collision now grew into a flashpoint for pent-up frustrations, historical wounds, and present-day divisions. The narrative spun outward from police reports and legal briefings to become nightly fodder for television, viral content for social media, and the subject of tense family dinners across communities. Emma Tran's case transformed into a mirror, sometimes a distortion, of the complex racial landscape in the United States. On platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, the story evolved rapidly, splintered apart, and recombined in ways the actual participants could barely recognize. Hashtags like #JusticeForEmma and #RememberTheTeens trended in parallel, each rallying thousands. In Asian American circles, Emma became a symbol of the so-called perpetual foreigner syndrome, the belief that no matter how assimilated, accomplished, or law-abiding one might be, Asian Americans would always be cast as outsiders. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens spoke out. Town hall meetings echoed with angry or tearful voices. Some invoked the history of anti-Asian scapegoating, referencing infamous moments from the Vincent Chin case in the 1980s to the burst of hate crimes against Asians in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. If Emma's name were Emily Smith, would this be different? One speaker demanded before local news cameras. Imagine if the kids involved weren't Black or Latino, would the world be this eager to pin everything on the immigrant driver? Another retorted in an online forum. But the counter-narratives were just as passionate. Families and advocates for the crash victims, many of whom came from Black and Latino backgrounds, saw Emma's story interwoven with their own histories of injustice, neglect, and pain. For these communities, long familiar with the phenomenon of being blamed, policed, or demonized, the idea of Emma as a victim provoked resentment, even outrage. Voices rang out at candlelight vigils and on call-in radio shows. We are tired of our children being killed and excused as accidents, swept aside because they are not seen as innocent. Where was the empathy for us when another Black or brown kid lost their life on these same streets? Some activists accused Emma's defenders of weaponizing victimhood while ignoring the suffering of others. Others fueled debate with historical context, recounting times when justice failed young men and women of color. In the feverish politics of the city, opportunists and true believers alike stoked the flames. Local politicians, eager to gain favor with important voting blocs, issued dueling statements, one promising full accountability for reckless drivers, another decrying unfair targeting of Asian Americans in our justice system. Community organizations rallied their bases. In some neighborhoods, anti-Asian leaflets appeared, blaming outsiders for changes or crime. On the other side, Asian-run businesses began to report an uptick in harassment and vandalism, noting that the hostile rhetoric had started to bleed out from the digital to the physical world. The press, especially tabloid outlets, did little to calm the situation. Headlines alternately blared, "Immigrant driver walks free after teen deaths," with Emma's face framed in unflattering light, or "Witch hunt for Asian woman in sensational trial." Newsrooms debated how to cover the tensions. Should they emphasize crime, systemic injustice, or the potential for healing? More often than not, passion won out over nuance. The legal proceedings themselves magnified the fracture lines. At the courthouse, protesters gathered almost every day. Signs reading "No more blood" and "End xenophobic prosecution" waved across barricades, often within spitting distance of one another. Sometimes heated arguments broke out, verbal battles of hashtags, statistics, and bitter personal stories flung like arrows between camps. At other times, moments of unexpected solidarity emerged. A parent from the victim's side offered comfort to Mrs. Tran, sobbing on the courthouse steps. But these rare flashes of empathy were drowned out by the roar of competing grievances. The backdrop for all this was a wider America, still reeling from its own reckonings. In the wake of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the Stop Asian Hate movement, the incident became a monstrous vessel, filled up with meanings that reached far beyond the facts at hand. Op-eds appeared in national dailies, linking the accident to cycles of urban neglect, underfunded schools, police reform, interminority conflict, and the chasm between immigrant dreams and American reality. College students organized teach-ins, clerics gave sermons on forgiveness and the limits of it. Sociologists were called onto primetime to explain the politics of trauma and community rivalry. In private, many families, Asian, Black, Latino, and white, found themselves on edge. Some parents changed their children's routines out of fear of new violence or harassment. Elderly Asian Americans signed up for self-defense courses. Black and Latino teens voiced disgust that their experiences were being flattened into a mere backdrop for someone else's tragedy. Friendships were tested, social trust frayed. Meanwhile, Emma's own family experienced the panic and isolation unique to being at the center of a racialized storm. Strangers sent both threats and words of comfort. Vietnamese language newspapers ran heartfelt columns about the emotional price of public scapegoating. The Trans Church organized vigils, both grieving the dead and fearing for Emma's safety. In some quarters, there was talk of leaving America altogether, a loss of faith in the promise that hard work and goodness would shield immigrants from the country's old prejudices. By the final weeks of the trial, the atmosphere in the city was electric and dangerous. Rumors of planned disruptions, doxing, and infiltration by agitators abounded, and police patrolled not only the courthouse but Emma's neighborhood and the local gathering places of both Asian and Black Latino communities. If there was hope to be found, it was in the handful of cross-ethnic alliances that quietly formed behind the scenes, lawyers and volunteers from different backgrounds sharing resources, trying to get out the message that justice should not be another pawn in the game of division. When the verdict finally came, the reactions could not have been more polarized. For some, Emma's acquittal was a rare instance of the system working. For others, it was yet another failure, a denial of their grief. In the months and years that followed, the court case lived on as a touchstone in debates about urban America, community safety, media bias, and the hard work of building trust between groups that share geography, but not always fate. The case didn't just expose a wound, it demanded that somehow the city figure out how to heal it. The fateful trial. The trial of Emma Tran unfolded over 3 tumultuous years, becoming more than just a question of one woman's guilt or innocence. Instead, it grew into a test case, a microcosm of America's struggles with justice, race, media, and the meaning of community. The courtroom itself felt transformed, shedding any sense of detachment as camera crews set up outside, protesters gathered daily, and security checkpoints became routine. For those inside, including the Tran family, each day felt like teetering on a precipice. Emma's legal ordeal began with daunting uncertainty. With limited funds, her family oscillated between public defenders and private counsel, sometimes switching attorneys midstream as resources hit their limit. The complicated process of pre-trial discovery, collecting documents, policing evidence, deposing witnesses, unfolded under a microscope. Every email between Emma and her parents, every tuition payment, bank statement, and even childhood report card seemed to fall under legal scrutiny. The prosecutors, under heavy public pressure and keen to appear tough on crime, left no stone unturned. They pressed technical experts to reconstruct the crash minute by minute. Yet the defense, battered but persistent, countered with their own specialists, and presented evidence of the scene's chaos and the irreparable loss of video footage. Jury selection itself was a minefield. Lawyers pored over questionnaires searching for hints of bias or covert prejudice. Questions went far beyond the facts of the case. What did prospective jurors think about immigrants, about police, about youth subcultures and urban crime? In private debriefs, Emma's attorneys debated removing any juror who seemed inflamed by the wall-to-wall media coverage. The judge, mindful of the case's sensitivity, stressed to the jury their duty to set aside outside opinions, a nearly impossible ask in an era of viral hashtags and 24-hour news. The day of opening statements, the courthouse pulsed with anticipation. The prosecutor painted a narrative of recklessness, highlighting the suffering of injured teens, the shattered families, and the obligation of motorists to protect life. He invoked lessons from recent tragedies, warning that lax standards would invite more carnage. Emma sat quietly as her lawyer responded with a counter-narrative. A hard-working college senior with no criminal record, targeted by circumstance and bad luck, who had no time to avoid the sudden, invisible danger unleashed by the illegal bike crew. Her counsel methodically stressed the lack of evidence of intoxication or phone use, the absence of video, and the chaotic intervention of bystanders who had altered the crash scene. The battle lines were meticulously drawn, each team aware that in the end, the verdict might turn on perception as much as fact. Testimony was wrenching for all involved. The parents of the teenagers gave sorrowful, sometimes furious accounts of their children's dreams, the midnight phone calls they wished they'd never answered, the hospital stays, and the funerals. Some jurors wept, others looked away. Emma, when she took the stand, described her actions in muted detail. Her cautious driving, her shock, the instant terror, and the overwhelming confusion that followed. Each side scrutinized her words and body language. The prosecution pressed her on every inconsistency, while her attorney gently teased out moments of empathy and context. Expert witnesses dueled over accident physics, car telemetry, and reaction times. One specialist for the prosecution argued a more alert driver would have reacted faster. A defense consultant insisted the teens' lack of lights and their sudden appearance made evasion impossible. The absence of decisive video haunted the proceedings. Prosecutors suggested, without ever directly accusing, that a nervous driver might recall events in a self-serving way. The defense countered, showing time-stamped phone and GPS logs, and calling out the city's malfunctioning surveillance infrastructure. More than once, the judge admonished both sides to avoid speculation and reminded the jury that only facts, not rumors, should guide their verdict. Despite these efforts, the reality was clear. Every juror carried their own shadow of experience, touched by stories of injustice, traffic violence, or the bitter legacy of divided communities. Deliberations dragged, consuming both stamina and spirit. For weeks, the Tran family arrived at court before sunrise, flanked by friends and packed snacks, bracing for the worst at every recess. Sometimes protesters jeered outside, other times sympathetic community members offered words of hope. Inside, the legal team sparred over the admissibility of late-breaking evidence, forensic simulations, fragmentary eyewitness statements, and character assessments. The prosecution tried to reframe the case on issues of public safety, declaring that every driver had a duty to anticipate the unpredictable, especially at night in a city bustling with youth. By contrast, the defense pleaded for understanding, describing an honest attempt at safe driving upended by the recklessness of others and a series of unlucky events. The media circus around the fateful trial only grew more intense as verdict time approached. Tabloid headlines argued the case daily, with opinion pieces on both sides fueling public anxiety. National news ran feature profiles of Emma, some sympathetic, some laced with suspicion. Protesters outside chanted, waved slogans, and live-streamed every moment. In the digital world, hashtags oscillated between calls for compassion and harsh recrimination. Conspiracy theories proliferated on forums. Was the investigation biased? Were the tapes tampered with? Was Emma scapegoated for political gain, or was she the recipient of special favors? The city felt split at its seams, and so did the people in the courthouse. The judge's instructions to the jury were somber and exacting. He revisited the standard of reasonable doubt, the presumption of innocence, and the unique weight of responsibility placed on citizens in a high-profile trial. He reminded them that neither pain nor anger could substitute for evidence, not even in the face of unimaginable tragedy. Your duty, he said, is not to heal the city, nor to settle the score, but to decide the fate of one person according to the law. For days the jury debated, revisiting testimony and reviewing the exhibit logs. They debated culpability, what constituted true recklessness, whether the absence of bike lights or youth impetuousness could ever shift duty from the driver, and whether, as some believed, the judicial process itself might be weighted by history or prejudice. Personal memories surfaced. a lost sibling, a near miss on a city street, a family immigration story. Some jurors advocated harsh accountability. Others argued the evidence simply wasn't strong enough. On the final day, as the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent except for heavy breathing and the occasional hush of weeping. Emma sat between her parents, hands clasped so tight her knuckles blanched. The jury foreperson, voice trembling, announced, "We find the defendant, Emma Tran, not guilty." For a few seconds, relief and disbelief mingled on both sides of the aisle. Emma's family broke into quiet, exhausted sobs. Some parents of the victims turned away, others sat in silent anger holding photographs of the lost. The judge thanked the jury for their service, acknowledging the immense difficulty of the decision. Emma stood and bowed her head, later offering a subdued apology to the families affected. "I am sorry for your pain, this was a tragedy for us all." But the trial's impact didn't end there. The acquittal set off another round of protests, some denouncing the verdict as a miscarriage of justice, others celebrating a rare victory for nuance and presumption of innocence. Advocacy groups pledged to continue fighting for safer streets, better surveillance policy, and fairer treatment for minorities in the legal system. Within days, think pieces and community forums debated what the verdict meant. Was it evidence that the system worked, or proof it remained broken? Emma, though freed from criminal responsibility, still faced years of healing, haunted by the memories, the relentless coverage, and the scars left on every family involved. For the city, the trial became a cautionary tale. It showed the cost of sensationalism, the peril of racial tension, and the power and limits of justice to bring closure to complex pain. In the records of that courthouse and in the memories of all who watched, the fateful trial of Emma Tran endured as a living lesson in the dilemmas and hard-won hopes of modern American society. Echoes, and an expensive lesson. In the months and years following the verdict, the echoes of the Emma Tran case continued to reverberate, with intensity and complexity echoing far beyond the courthouse. For some, the trial's close brought a measure of relief, or at least resolution. For others, it only deepened old wounds and stirred up unresolved questions about justice, fate, and what it means to share a city with people whose stories are so radically different from their own. Emma herself found that freedom wasn't as simple as stepping outside the walls of a courtroom. Though exonerated, she bore the invisible scars of public scrutiny and legal ordeal. She struggled with guilt and survivor's anxiety, coping with therapy sessions and persistent nightmares. In Vietnamese language newspapers and community circles, she became a symbol of both resilience and the impossible expectations placed on immigrant children. The Tran family, once low profile, was approached for interviews, public forums, and even educational events about road safety. Navigating newfound notoriety became its own kind of trial. On the other side, families of the teenagers who lost their lives or suffered injury during the crash were left with a chasm that nothing seemed able to fill. Even as calls for appeals and new civil cases faded with time, the pain did not diminish. Some forged connections with advocacy groups for safe cycling and youth mentoring, pushing for stricter regulations and greater investment in after-school programs. Others felt left behind by a system they viewed as stacked against them from the start, one shaped by gaps in economic opportunity as much as by the details of a fateful night. In both public statements and private moments, rage mingled with heartbreak, and closure remained elusive. Meanwhile, the city itself was forever changed, not just by headlines but by the conversations and debates sparked in classrooms, city halls, and on street corners. New York's legislative bodies moved quickly to examine policy gaps exposed by the case. City council meetings grew contentious as stakeholders debated the best way to prevent similar tragedies. Should there be mandatory bike safety courses in schools, tighter curfews? Should infrastructure be updated to better accommodate all road users? Or would such steps go ignored by those determined to skirt the rules? Law enforcement agencies faced their own reckoning. The NYPD, in particular, underwent public reviews of pursuit policies and the training officers received when responding to chaotic, emotionally charged scenes. Consultants were hired to recommend reforms, such as de-escalation protocols and community liaison programs. While some officers resented the scrutiny, others admitted privately that the Emma Tran case had revealed blind spots in their understanding of both youth culture and immigrant anxieties. Partnerships sprouted between police precincts and cultural organizations to build trust and foster open, sometimes difficult dialogues. Journalists, too, reflected on their roles. More ethics workshops were held on how to report on legal dramas without sensationalizing or encouraging racial resentment. Newsrooms reviewed their editorial standards after several outlets were criticized for inflammatory coverage. A handful of journalists began working on long-form documentaries or podcasts designed to present the gray areas, letting survivors, advocates, and ordinary citizens narrate the nuances missing from courtroom soundbites. For some in the media, the greatest lesson was that the truth is often messier than headlines allow, and that compassion, not just breaking news, should guide the storytelling. One of the deeper consequences of the Emma Tran case was the slow, often painful process of community reckoning. Local churches, youth groups, and immigrant associations hosted healing circles and public forums, inviting people to share their fears, hopes, and disappointments openly. Although heated arguments sometimes erupted, these spaces also led to surprising solidarity. Parents exchanged stories of raising children between cultures, and teenagers described how both discrimination and opportunity had shaped their choices. In multi-ethnic neighborhoods, shared grief sometimes seeded new friendships across the fault lines of identity. Policy advocates seized the moment to push for broader reforms, some aimed at equity in the legal system, others at mental health support for youth under stress, or resources for families living on economic margins. Nonprofits framed the tragedy as a wake-up call, part of a constellation of social problems that could no longer be ignored or blamed solely on individual bad choices. This activism energized a wave of youth leaders and first-time voters, moving them from the sidelines of city life into the heart of policy discourse. Still, the legacy of division was slow to fade. On social media, and in certain corners of the city, mistrust simmered, sometimes erupting at school board meetings or local elections. There were sporadic incidents of racial harassment, and the sense that injustice, whether real or perceived, might breed further harm rather than understanding. Some parents were more cautious about letting their children out at night. Others doubled down on messages of solidarity, enrolling in anti-bias workshops and sharing Emma's story as a case study in the dangers of oversimplification. Academics and civil rights scholars highlighted the way Emma Tran's story illuminated the intersection of race, class, and generational divide in America's urban melting pot. University panels dissected the case, using it to teach about legal process, restorative justice, and the pitfalls of trial by media. Some saw hope in the emergence of inter-community dialogue, pointing to the incremental difficult work of healing, as rare, but worth fighting for. Emma herself was changed forever. Though she sometimes wished to disappear, she gradually found her voice, speaking at high schools and civic events about the importance of safety, courage, and forgiveness. Her message, shaped by ordeal, was both cautionary and quietly optimistic. That tragedy can break lives, but resilience, dialogue, and honest reckoning can also plant seeds for better understanding. The painful lessons of her case, absorbed by families, officials, and youth across the city, became a reminder that justice is not a single event. It is a journey, sustained by hope shared, pain acknowledged, and the resolve to do better by one another. The final message. In the days and weeks after the trial's conclusion, Emma Tran found herself consumed by a complex combination of relief, sorrow, and uncertainty about her place in the world. While public interest began to wane and media coverage gradually transitioned to the next headline, a deep sense of responsibility lingered. Emma understood that no verdict, no matter how much evidence was examined or how exhaustively the courts deliberated, could undo the irrevocable impacts of that night. Families had lost children, bonds of trust between neighbors were fraying. Entire communities, once only tenuously connected, were now more aware of one another's pain than ever before. Feeling a duty to address not only her own healing but also the unrest her case had triggered, Emma chose to step forward. She was invited to share her thoughts publicly, first at a televised community forum, then in a nationally broadcast interview, and finally in a poignant written statement that was distributed to schools, libraries, and community centers across New York City. Through each of these appearances, Emma's goal was not only to express her personal regret and empathy to all families affected, but to hold up a mirror to the broader society that had both judged and witnessed her ordeal. Her televised address began simply, but the quiet directness in her voice made an indelible impression. Emma stood, visibly worn yet composed, and spoke not as a defendant, but as a peer, a neighbor, and in many ways a symbol of the city's fragile aspirations. "I'm not here to relive the tragedy or defend myself yet again," she said. I know there are wounds that will never fully heal and anger that words will never reach. I am deeply, profoundly sorry for the loss, the hurt, and the fear that has followed in the wake of everything that happened. No one should have to lose their child. No one should have to live under a cloud of suspicion and hate. Emma's message extended far beyond her personal circumstances. She called for an honest reckoning with the factors that had made such an accident possible: urban neglect, youth restlessness, cultural misunderstanding, a patchwork of regulations, and the polarizing effects of media. She pleaded for greater investment in youth programs, safer streets, and mechanisms for real dialogue between police and residents. Above all, she urged her fellow New Yorkers and all Americans listening to see each other's humanity, even when disagreement or grief makes that seem impossible. Beyond the televised moment, Emma continued her outreach, working quietly with local organizations and advocacy groups. She attended support sessions with bereaved families, each meeting an emotional minefield where apology and forgiveness struggled to coexist. Instead of shying away from public scrutiny, she accepted invitations to participate in school panels about traffic safety and civic engagement. There, she spoke candidly about shame, vulnerability, and the ways in which ordinary people could find themselves at the center of extraordinary events in the blink of an eye. In her written statement, soon reprinted in several languages, Emma articulated a vision for a kind of collective healing that would require more than new laws or temporary community bridges. We have seen how quickly suspicion can breed division, how easily pain can be weaponized, she wrote. If there is anything I can offer as a lesson, it is that compassion is not a luxury. It is a necessity for me, for my family, for my city. She spoke directly to young people, those who felt unheard or invisible in the institutions of their city. I wish I could undo what happened, she wrote, but I cannot. Instead, I ask you to make choices that honor your own life and the lives around you. Your worth is not measured by how much risk you take or how loud your pain can shout on the internet. Find your place not in darkness or rebellion, but in possibility, in honest conversation, and in care for everyone who shares this city with you. Emma's final message became more than a formality at the close of a sensational trial. It was embraced by advocates and educators as a resource for navigating grief, conflict, and reconciliation. Journalists who had once dissected her every move began to reflect, in print and on air, on the deeper social lessons of her journey. Her words, sorrowful yet inviting, prompted others to step forward with their own accounts of hurt, loss, or transformation, opening space for new forms of dialogue where blame and bitterness might otherwise have prevailed. Over time, Emma's ongoing presence in public life became a reminder that no single story can bear the weight of an entire city's hopes and wounds. She returned to her studies quietly, pursued community work, and often chose to remain in the background, supporting initiatives that promoted traffic safety and inter-ethnic understanding. She declined book and film offers, believing that some tragedies were too sacred for entertainment, and instead focused on contributing, in small but meaningful ways, to a gentler, more attentive civic culture. Yet the echo of her final message persisted, in classrooms, in church basements, in police training seminars, and in the whispered conversations among parents who feared for their children's future. Emma's story did not erase the fractures America faces, nor did it bring perfect resolution to the families marked by grief, but in her message there was a blueprint for moving forward: humility in the face of suffering, courage to confront uncomfortable truths, and above all, an insistence on dignity and compassion for all who live side by side in a world where fate and choice collide.